Dear brothers and sisters, a portion of our revenue is donated to religious orders to pray for souls. If you need prayer for someone, please leave their saint's name below. Thank you for supporting Faith Wonders.
The Capuchin monastery rested in silence, cradled by the dry hills of southern Italy. Its stone walls had learned over centuries how to keep secrets. Even the wind that passed through the olive trees seemed to lower its voice as it crossed the courtyard, as though instinctively aware that this was a place where silence itself prayed. In a narrow archive room, lit by a single yellow lamp, an old friar stood alone. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from age, as he reached for a folder buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. The shelves around him were filled with neatly ordered records, baptisms, confessions, permissions long expired. This one, however, had been deliberately hidden behind heavier volumes, as if hoping time would erase it. He brushed the dust away slowly. On the cover, written in faded ink, were words that had never been meant for curious eyes. Archivio riservato. Caso infantile, file XXP 19XX. The friar closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered the day this file was sealed. No bells had rung, no announcement had been made. The church, cautious as ever, had chosen silence over proclamation. Some events, it was decided, were not meant to strengthen faith through spectacle, but through humility. Opening the folder, he found handwritten testimonies, medical notes, and prayer records, each page bearing witness to something that could not be easily explained nor easily denied. At the center of them all was the name of a child who could not speak, a child who could not hear, a child who had drawn the attention of darkness and perhaps of grace. The friar exhaled softly and closed the file once more. Outside, the monastery bell rang for evening prayer. This case had never been published, never debated, never declared a miracle, and yet it had never truly been forgotten. They baptized her Lucia after the ancient saint of light, though no one in the village could remember a time when light had ever truly touched the child's world. She was 6 years old and had never spoken a word, not a cry at birth, not a laugh in infancy, not even the broken syllables other children learned to form before understanding their meaning. The doctors in the nearby town confirmed what her mother already feared. Lucia was both deaf and mute from birth. Whatever silence lived inside her, it had been there from the beginning. Lucia lived with her mother in a small stone house at the edge of the village, where the road thinned into dirt and the hills rose dry and bare. During the day, the child sat for hours by the window or beneath the fig tree in the yard, tracing shapes in the dust with her fingers. She did not play as other children did. She did not call for attention. She simply observed. And it was her eyes that unsettled people most. They were dark and unnaturally attentive, following movements no one else noticed. When someone entered a room, Lucia's gaze often shifted before the door even opened, as though she sensed the presence ahead of time. At Mass, she stared at the altar with an intensity that made some parishioners uncomfortable. Yet when the priest lifted the crucifix, her expression sometimes tightened, her small hands curling into fists, her breath turning sharp and uneven. The villagers were kind, but kindness did not silence curiosity. Mothers pulled their children closer when Lucia passed. Old men crossed themselves without knowing why. It was not that the girl was cruel or wild. She was gentle, obedient, and never harmed a soul. Still, an unspoken unease followed her like a shadow. "She listens to someone we cannot hear," they whispered among themselves, careful that her mother would not catch their words. God did not take her voice without reason. Lucia's mother, Maria, heard the murmurs anyway. In a village as small as theirs, silence traveled poorly. At night, Maria watched her daughter sleep, studying the slow rise and fall of her chest, searching for signs of peace. Sometimes Lucia smiled in her dreams. Other times, her lips moved soundlessly, shaping words that never reached the air. Once, just before dawn, Maria awoke to find Lucia sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the corner of the room. When Maria touched her shoulder, the child flinched as though pulled abruptly from a conversation. From that day on, Maria understood something she dared not name. Her daughter's silence was not empty, it was occupied. The first signs were easy to dismiss. When Lucia was brought into the village church, she stiffened in her mother's arms, her small body tightening as though bracing against cold. Maria told herself it was the crowd, the incense, the unfamiliar space. But when the priest raised the crucifix at the altar, Lucia's reaction sharpened into something unmistakable. Her face twisted in sudden distress, and a sound tore from her throat. Not a word, not a cry, but a raw, broken wail that echoed briefly beneath the stone ceiling. Maria fled the church that day with her child pressed to her chest, her heart pounding harder than Lucia's had. After that, Maria stopped bringing her to Mass. At home, other things began to surface. Lucia started drawing obsessively, covering scraps of paper and the backs of old prayer cards with charcoal and dirt. The figures she drew were not childish shapes or simple animals. They were distorted forms, elongated limbs, hollow faces, eyes scratched over again and again until the paper tore. Some figures appeared bound, others seemed to bend inward, collapsing into themselves. No one had taught her these images. No one in the household owned books or pictures that could have planted such visions. When Maria tried to take the drawings away, Lucia reacted with panic, clutching the papers tightly and shaking her head in violent refusal. Her breath came fast, her eyes wild, as if those twisted shapes were not merely drawings, but records of something she feared losing. Then came the nights. Almost every morning, Maria woke to find Lucia already awake, sitting upright in her bed, staring into the darkness. It always happened around the same hour, 3 in the morning. The child's eyes were open, unblinking, her face pale in the moonlight. Sometimes her lips moved silently. Sometimes tears streamed down her cheeks without a sound. Maria tried lighting a candle beside the bed, whispering prayers she had learned as a girl. Each time she traced the sign of the cross over her daughter's forehead, Lucia recoiled, pressing herself deeper into the mattress as if shrinking from an unseen blow. Once, when Maria placed a small wooden crucifix near her pillow, Lucia swept it to the floor with a sudden, forceful motion, then began to tremble uncontrollably. From that night on, Maria hid the crucifix in a drawer. Fear crept into her life quietly, disguising itself as exhaustion. She stopped sleeping. She stopped inviting neighbors into the house. Every sound after sunset made her flinch. She no longer knew whether she was protecting her child or protecting others from her. Maria did not speak of possession. She did not accuse the devil or name any darkness aloud. She was a simple woman, raised to believe that such matters belonged to priests and saints, not mothers. Still, as she watched her daughters sit in silence, listening to something no one else could hear, Maria felt a truth pressing against her chest like a weight. Whatever held Lucia's attention in the night did not come from God, and it was growing bolder. Maria learned to suffer silently. During the day, she moved through her chores like a woman performing penance, washing clothes in cold water, kneading bread with aching hands, sweeping the same floor twice as if order might return if she tried hard enough. At night, when Lucia finally slept, Maria sat beside the bed and replayed every moment of her daughter's life, searching for the instant where she might have failed. Had she sinned too greatly? Had she prayed too little? Had God taken her child's voice as a punishment? These questions pressed against her heart, unanswered and relentless. She sought help wherever she could. The village doctor examined Lucia carefully, shining lights into her ears, watching her eyes, tapping gently on her knees. He spoke of nerves and development, of limits science could not cross. A traveling healer passed through months later, burning herbs and muttering old words that Maria barely understood. Nothing changed. Lucia remained locked in her silence, her nights growing more troubled, her drawings darker. In desperation, Maria borrowed money she could not spare and took Lucia to the city to see a specialist who spoke of the mind, trauma, inner worlds, unspoken fear. He asked questions Lucia could not answer and prescribed patience, routine, time. Maria nodded, though something inside her knew this, too, was not the path they needed. Each failure deepened her isolation. Neighbors stopped offering advice. Even the priest, though kind, spoke cautiously, urging prayer without venturing further. Maria prayed, yes, but her prayers had become wordless, hollowed out by exhaustion. She no longer asked for miracles, she only begged for rest. One night, after Lucia had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep, Maria collapsed onto her own bed without lighting a candle. Tears soaked into the pillow as she whispered a final plea into the darkness, not even sure to whom she was speaking anymore. That was when the dream came. She found herself standing in a bare stone room, lit softly as though by dawn. The air was heavy with stillness. Before her stood a friar in a simple brown habit, his hands covered by dark gloves. His face was worn, marked by suffering, yet his eyes were unlike anything she had ever seen. They seemed to look not at her, but through her, reaching the places she had tried hardest to hide. He did not speak. He did not need to. In his gaze, Maria felt her guilt laid bare, but not condemned. She felt her fear named without being mocked. And beneath it all, she felt something she had not known for years: permission to hope. As she looked closer, she noticed faint stains at the edges of the gloves, darker than the fabric itself. The friar raised one hand slightly, as if to bless her, then slowly turned away, pointing toward a door she had not noticed before. Maria woke with a sharp intake of breath. Her room was dark. Lucia slept quietly for once, yet Maria's heart raced as though she had been called by name. She did not know who the friar was or why his presence lingered so strongly in her chest. But she knew this with sudden clarity. She and her daughter could not remain where they were, and help, whatever form it would take, would not come to them. The fever came without warning. Lucia's skin burned beneath Maria's hands, her small body trembling as though caught between fire and cold. Maria pressed damp cloths to her daughter's forehead and whispered prayers she barely remembered, her voice shaking with fatigue and fear. The house felt unnaturally still, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Lucia's eyes remained closed, yet her lips began to move. At first, Maria thought it was only the restless motion of a sick child, but then she heard it. A sound, faint, broken. Not a cry, not a word, but something closer to a breath, shaped by intention. Maria froze, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe. Lucia's mouth formed the sound again. P-O. The syllables were imperfect, fragile, as if forced through a door that had never been opened before. Maria's heart slammed against her ribs. Her daughter had never spoken, never even attempted a sound that resembled speech, and yet there it was, unmistakable and deliberate. P.O. Maria felt the room tilt. She had never spoken that name aloud, not once. It was not a name used in their home, not one whispered in bedtime stories or taught in prayer. Lucia had not been to church in months. No visitor had mentioned it, no book, no picture, no conversation could have planted it in the child's silent mind. And yet the name returned, again and again, slipping from Lucia's lips as the fever rose. Her expression changed as she murmured it. The tension that usually tightened her face seemed to loosen, replaced by something quieter, almost relieved. Tears streamed from the corners of her closed eyes, but her breathing slowed, as if some unseen struggle had eased its grip. Maria knelt beside the bed, clutching the sheets with trembling hands. Fear surged through her, sharp and immediate, but beneath it stirred something else, recognition. The dream returned to her with sudden clarity, the friar in brown, his gloved hands, his penetrating gaze. The same stillness filled the room now. As the night deepened, Lucia's fever finally broke. Her skin cooled, her breathing settled into a gentle rhythm. The whispering stopped. For the first time in weeks, she slept without stirring at the hour Maria had come to dread. When dawn arrived, pale and hesitant, Maria remained by the bedside, exhausted but wide awake. Lucia slept on, her face calm, her hands relaxed upon the blanket. Maria pressed her forehead to the edge of the bed and wept, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what she could no longer deny. Someone had reached her child, not through sound, not through words, through a name. And though Maria did not yet understand what it meant, she knew this truth with a certainty that frightened her more than the fever had. That name was not spoken by chance. It had been given. Maria had not intended to stop at the church that morning. She was on her way to the market, her thoughts heavy and unfocused, when she noticed the old woman sitting on the low stone wall near the church steps. The woman's back was bent with age, her black shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, despite the warmth of the sun. She held a rosary in her hands, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if time obeyed a different rhythm for her. As Maria passed, the woman looked up. Her eyes were pale and sharp, unsettlingly alert. They rested on Maria for a moment longer than politeness required, then shifted, past her, toward the child walking quietly at her side. "She does not hear," the woman said softly. Maria stopped. A dozen replies rose to her lips, but none emerged. Instead, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She nodded once. The woman studied Lucia's face, her stillness, the distant focus of her gaze. Then she leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice, as if sharing a confidence rather than offering advice. "If the child cannot hear men, let her be brought where God once listened." The words struck Maria with the force of a bell rung too close. She stared at the woman, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" Maria asked. The old woman smiled faintly, the lines of her face deepening. "Some places remember prayer," she replied, "not because the stones are holy, but because suffering knelt there long enough to leave a mark." She gestured toward the hills in the distance, though none were visible from where they stood. "There is a monastery in San Giovanni Rotondo, a Capuchin place. A friar once lived there, a man who listened when heaven and hell both spoke." Maria's breath caught. She did not say the name, but Maria heard it all the same. Padre Pio. "I am only a mother," Maria whispered. "I do not know such things." The woman's gaze softened. "That is why you must go," she said simply. "Faith does not require understanding, only courage." Before Maria could ask another question, the church bell rang. When she turned back, the old woman was already rising, moving away with slow, measured steps. By the time Maria reached the wall again, the place was empty. No one nearby recalled seeing her. Maria stood there for a long moment, Lucia's small hand resting in hers. The words echoed in her mind, steady and insistent. Where God once listened. That evening, Maria began to prepare for a journey she had never imagined taking, guided not by certainty, but by the quiet conviction that they had finally been shown a direction. The journey began before dawn, when the village still slept and the sky hung low and colorless above the hills. Maria carried only what she could afford to lose: a small bag of bread, a change of clothes for Lucia, and a worn rosary tucked into her pocket. Every step away from home felt uncertain, as though she were abandoning the little stability she had left, yet remaining had become impossible. They traveled as the poor always did, by foot when they could, by borrowed rides when Providence allowed. On crowded buses, Maria held Lucia close, shielding her from the jostling bodies and curious glances. The child remained unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, her fingers twisting restlessly in the fabric of Maria's sleeve. As the miles stretched on, Lucia's behavior began to change. She grew agitated, tugging at Maria's hand, her breathing quickening for no visible reason. At one point, she pressed her palms against her ears and shook her head violently, though no sound disturbed the air. When Maria tried to comfort her, Lucia pulled away, her face contorted with fear, as if she sensed something approaching long before Maria could. By the time the monastery came into view, perched solemnly against the hillside, Lucia was trembling. The bells were silent. No crowds gathered at the gates. The place did not announce itself as holy. It simply stood, unmoving, its stone walls weathered by decades of prayer and suffering. The air around it felt heavier, thick with a stillness that settled deep into the chest. Lucia resisted with sudden strength as they crossed the threshold. She stiffened, her small body arching backward, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Maria struggled to hold her, whispering reassurances she herself did not believe. For a moment, she nearly turned back, overwhelmed by the fear that she was leading her child into something far worse. Then, just as abruptly, the resistance stopped. Lucia went limp in Maria's arms, her breathing slowing. Her eyes opened, no longer wild, but distant, fixed on the monastery walls as though recognizing something long forgotten. Tears slid quietly down her cheeks, though her face remained calm. Inside the courtyard, the silence deepened. It was not empty, but attentive, as if the place itself were listening. The scent of old stone and wax lingered in the air. Each footstep echoed softly, respectful, restrained. A friar passed them without a word, offering only a brief nod. No one questioned their presence, no one asked why they had come. Maria felt both exposed and protected at once. Whatever forces had followed them here, she sensed, could not move freely within these walls. The weight in the air was undeniable, solemn, heavy with memory, but beneath it flowed something gentler, steadier. Peace earned through suffering. As Maria held Lucia closer, standing at the edge of the courtyard, she realized with a quiet certainty that their journey had reached its true beginning. Here, silence had once spoken back. The friar who received them said little. He listened as Maria spoke in halting fragments, her voice low, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not use the words possession or evil. She spoke only of silence, fear, and a child who reacted to prayer as though it were pain. The friar's expression did not change, but when Maria mentioned the name her daughter had whispered, his gaze sharpened briefly, like a flame catching air. Without explanation, he nodded. They were led through narrow corridors worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet. The walls were bare, the light dim, the air cool and still. Every sound, every breath, every step felt amplified, as though the monastery were listening as carefully as it once had. The friar stopped before a simple wooden door. This was his cell, he said quietly. Inside, the room was smaller than Maria had imagined. A narrow bed, a rough table, a chair. No ornament, no comfort. The walls bore faint marks where countless prayers had leaned against them. The silence here was different, not empty, not oppressive, but dense, like a held breath. As soon as they crossed the threshold, Lucia froze. Her body went rigid in Maria's arms, then slowly stilled. Her eyes remained open, unblinking, fixed on nothing in particular. She did not cry. She did not resist. She did not move at all. "Lucia?" Maria whispered, panic rising. No response. The friar watched closely, his hands folded within the sleeves of his habit. After a moment, he stepped forward and knelt beside the child, careful not to touch her. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "She is not sleeping," he said. Maria's heart clenched. What is happening to her? The friar did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes and bowed his head, as if listening inwardly. The stillness in the room deepened, pressing against Maria's ears until she felt lightheaded. "There is a presence here," the friar said at last, "and it does not belong to the child." The words landed heavily, yet they were spoken without alarm, without accusation. They were an observation, not a judgment. Lucia's breathing remained steady, unnaturally so. Her small hands rested open at her sides, relaxed in a way Maria had never seen before. It was as if something within her had paused, uncertain. The friar rose slowly. "We will not force anything," he said. "Whatever this is, it has learned fear. That alone tells us it is not welcome." He gestured toward the bed. "Let her rest here." Maria hesitated, every instinct screaming to keep her child close, but the silence in the room, patient, watchful, held her still. With trembling care, she laid Lucia on the narrow bed where a saint had once suffered and slept. As they stepped back, the friar made the sign of the cross, not over the child, but over the room itself. In that cell, where words had once failed and prayer had taken their place, something unseen shifted, and for the first time since her birth, Lucia was completely, unnaturally still. No candles were lit. No commands were spoken. The friar made this clear from the beginning. What was about to take place, he explained softly, was not an exorcism. There would be no raised voices, no confrontation with what could not be seen. Force, he said, invited resistance. Humility invited truth. They gathered in the small cell as evening light filtered through the narrow window, casting long, pale shadows along the stone walls. Maria sat beside the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Lucia lay motionless, her eyes open but unfocused, her breathing shallow and even. The friar began the rosary. His voice was low, steady, unhurried. Each word fell into the silence like a drop of water into deep stone. Maria joined him hesitantly at first, her voice trembling, then stronger as the rhythm carried her forward. The prayers were familiar, worn smooth by years of repetition, yet here they felt newly exposed, stripped of habit, reduced to their simplest form. They did not pray for miracles, they did not demand answers. They asked only for mercy. As the beads slipped through the friar's fingers, Lucia's body began to respond. A faint tremor passed through her arms, then her legs. Her fingers curled slowly into the blanket, gripping the coarse fabric as though anchoring herself against an unseen pull. Tears formed at the corners of her eyes. They slid silently down her temples and disappeared into her hair. No sound accompanied them, no sob, no whimper, only the quiet evidence of something stirring deep within her. Maria leaned forward instinctively, fighting the urge to speak, to interrupt what she sensed was fragile and precise. The friar did not change his tone. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," he prayed, his voice unwavering, "pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." At the mention of death, Lucia's breathing hitched. Her chest rose sharply, then stilled. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. The tremors subsided, leaving behind a stillness more intense than before. Maria felt something loosen inside her own chest, a knot she had carried for years without realizing it. For the first time, she was not pleading with God from a place of panic. She was kneeling in surrender. When the final prayer was spoken, the silence returned, deeper and fuller than before. The friar closed his eyes, resting his hand lightly over the rosary, as if listening for an echo that did not come. Lucia lay quietly. Her face was peaceful, her brow uncreased. Though her eyes remained open, the distant tension that usually clouded them had softened. The tears had dried, leaving faint tracks upon her skin. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No voice had spoken, no struggle had broken the calm. Yet all three of them understood the same thing without words. Something had been acknowledged, and something else, whatever had held the child so tightly, had begun at last to loosen its grip. The monastery slept lightly that night. Its corridors lay dark and quiet, broken only by the distant creak of old wood and the soft rustle of habits as a few friars moved to late prayer. Maria lay awake on a narrow cot beside Lucia's bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting each breath her daughter took. Peace, she had learned, never arrived without protest. It began shortly after midnight. Lucia stirred, her body shifting restlessly beneath the blanket. Her hands clenched, then relaxed, then clenched again, as though responding to an invisible tug. Maria sat up at once, reaching for her, but hesitated when she saw Lucia's face. The child's eyes were closed, yet her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed tight in silent resistance. Then her body arched, not violently, not suddenly, but with a slow, deliberate tension, as if something were pulling her from within. Maria grasped Lucia's shoulders, whispering her name, trying to ground her in the familiar weight of touch. Lucia's head turned sharply to the side, away from her mother, her breath quickening. That was when Maria heard it. A whisper. It did not come from Lucia's mouth. Her lips remained sealed, unmoving. The sound seemed to rise from the air itself, brushing against Maria's ears like a breath too close for comfort. It was low, urgent, layered, impossible to locate, impossible to ignore. Maria froze. The words were indistinct, fragmented, slipping away the moment she tried to grasp them. Yet their intent was unmistakable. They were not prayers, they were not pleas. They were claims. Fear surged through her, cold and paralyzing. Every instinct screamed to run, to call for help, to break the silence that pressed in from all sides. Instead, Maria did the only thing she could think to do. She prayed. Her voice shook as she whispered the Hail Mary, the words tumbling over one another, clumsy and desperate. The whisper in the room seemed to thicken, pushing back, pressing closer, as though offended by the sound of her faith. Lucia's body trembled beneath Maria's hands, her breathing ragged, uneven. Then, just as suddenly, the tension broke. Lucia collapsed back onto the mattress, her muscles slack, her breath slowing. The whisper faded, retreating into the corners of the room, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence. Maria remained where she was, her hands still gripping her daughter, afraid that if she let go, whatever had withdrawn might return. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. Lucia's face smoothed, the furrow in her brow easing. She slept again, deeply this time, her breathing steady and calm. No further movement came. Maria did not sleep for the rest of the night. She sat upright until dawn, her rosary wrapped tightly around her fingers, her ears straining for any sound that did not belong. When the first pale light crept through the window, illuminating the stone walls, she felt both relief and dread. Whatever had followed them to the monastery had not surrendered easily. It had resisted, and Maria knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that the night had only been the beginning. The young friar had not known why he woke before the bell. Sleep had left him suddenly, cleanly, as though it had never been there at all. His cell was still dark, the air cool against his skin. For a moment he lay motionless, listening to the faint breathing of the monastery. Stones settling, distant footsteps, the quiet presence of men given over to prayer. Then he remembered the dream. He had been standing in a narrow room, bare and familiar, though he could not at first place it. Light entered from a single window, pale and restrained. A friar stood near the bed, his back turned, his shoulders stooped with suffering. He wore a brown habit, worn thin at the edges, and dark gloves that concealed his hands. When the man turned, the young friar felt his breath catch. He had never seen Padre Pio in life. He knew him only from photographs and stories, from the reverent caution with which the older brothers spoke his name. Yet there was no doubt, no hesitation. Recognition came not through the eyes, but through the weight of presence. Padre Pio did not speak at once. His gaze was steady, penetrating, as though measuring not the friar's worth, but his willingness to listen. The room felt crowded, thick with a silence that demanded humility rather than fear. At last, Padre Pio spoke. "Do not command," he said. His voice was low, restrained, edged with authority that did not seek to dominate. Prayer is not a weapon, it is a door. The young friar tried to speak, but no words came. Evil flees humility, not noise, not pride, not the desire to be seen. He lifted one gloved hand slightly, as if to caution restraint. Let the child be surrounded, not confronted. What does not belong will leave when it finds no place to stand. The light in the room dimmed. The figure began to fade, not dissolving but receding, as if stepping backward into memory rather than vanishing outright. The young friar woke with a sharp intake of breath. Now, sitting upright in his cell, the weight of the dream pressed heavily upon him. He did not rush to interpret it as a vision. He did not claim certainty. In the monastery, such matters were approached with caution, even suspicion. Dreams were tested by silence, not proclaimed. At morning prayer, he said nothing. But later that day, when he found the older friar who had been guiding Maria and her daughter, he spoke carefully, choosing each word with deliberate restraint. He did not say Padre Pio had appeared. He said only that he felt strongly they must not escalate what was taking place. "We should continue as we have begun," he said, quietly, without authority, without spectacle. The older friar studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That has always been Padre Pio's way," he said. The decision was made. There would be no formal rite, no gathering of witnesses, no attempt to name or confront what resisted them. The prayers would continue, simple, consistent, almost invisible. The child would remain in the monastery, surrounded by routine, humility, and the steady rhythm of faith. Maria was told only that they would keep praying. She accepted this without protest. After the night she had endured, she no longer sought explanations. She sought endurance. She sought trust. As the sun lowered over the monastery walls, the young friar passed the cell where Lucia slept. For a moment, he thought he sensed a familiar stillness there, not heavy, not threatening, but watchful. Whether Padre Pio had appeared, or whether the memory of him had simply spoken through the silence, the effect was the same. They would not command, they would pray, and they would wait. The moment came without warning. It was late afternoon, the hour when the monastery seemed to exhale, releasing the heat of the day into long shadows that stretched across the stone floors. Lucia had been calm all morning, unusually so, following Maria through the corridors with quiet steps, her hand resting lightly in her mother's grasp. They had been allowed to enter the small chapel that housed one of the monastery's most guarded relics, a simple cloth, protected behind glass, associated with the suffering and prayer of Padre Pio. No ceremony accompanied their visit. No one announced their presence. It was meant to be a moment of private devotion, nothing more. As they approached the altar, Lucia suddenly stopped. Her fingers slipped from Maria's hand. For a heartbeat, the child stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the relic before her. Then her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the stone floor without a sound. Maria cried out and rushed forward, gathering Lucia into her arms. The friars who had been nearby froze in place, instinctively holding back. No one spoke. No one moved. Time seemed to fold inward. Lucia did not convulse. She did not cry or struggle. Her body lay slack against the cold stone, her breathing shallow but steady. Her face was calm, more peaceful than Maria had ever seen it. And then the silence deepened. It was not the absence of noise, but something fuller, heavier. The air itself felt suspended, as though the chapel had been sealed from the world beyond its walls. Even Maria's thoughts slowed, her panic dissolving into a strange, unwarranted stillness. There was no light, no warmth, no sensation of presence pressing in. Only peace. A peace so complete it bordered on emptiness, as if whatever had struggled within the child had reached the edge of itself and found nowhere else to go. Maria held Lucia close, her tears falling silently onto her daughter's hair, yet even her grief felt distant, softened. Minutes passed, or seconds. Maria could not tell. When Lucia finally stirred, it was with a small, almost imperceptible breath. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. For the first time, her eyes did not seem to search or strain. They rested, clear and untroubled, as though the long vigil of watching had ended. Maria gasped softly. Lucia's gaze met hers, not with confusion, not with fear, but with recognition. Something unspoken passed between them, something Maria could not name but felt settled deep within her bones. A friar knelt beside them and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving, his voice barely audible. He did not look surprised, only relieved. No bells rang, no witnesses were summoned, no declaration was made. Lucia was carried gently back to her room, where she slept through the evening and into the night without disturbance. No whispers followed, no trembling returned. In the quiet that remained, the monastery seemed unchanged, yet those who had been present felt it all the same. A breaking point had been reached, not through force, not through command, but through a silence so complete that nothing unworthy could remain within it. Morning arrived gently, as if unwilling to disturb what had taken place the day before. Soft light slipped through the narrow window of the small room where Lucia slept, resting on the pale stone walls and the simple wooden furniture. Maria sat beside the bed, her hands folded, her body heavy with exhaustion, yet unwilling to surrender to sleep. She watched her daughter breathe, each rise and fall of Lucia's chest a quiet reassurance that the night had passed in peace. Lucia stirred. At first, it was nothing more than a slight movement, a shift beneath the blanket. Then her fingers twitched, curling and uncurling as if discovering their own weight. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, revealing eyes that were clearer than Maria remembered, unburdened, almost curious. Maria leaned forward instinctively. "Lucia," she whispered. The child turned her head toward the sound, not sharply, not in confusion, but with intention. Her lips parted. Time seemed to stop. A sound emerged, soft, hesitant, but unmistakably shaped. It was not a cry of fear or pain. It carried no distress, no urgency. It was a word formed with effort, fragile yet precise, as though it had been waiting patiently for the right moment to exist. "Mama." The single syllable fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Maria's breath caught violently in her throat. For a heartbeat, she could not move, could not speak, could not even believe what her ears had heard. The word lingered in the air, real and undeniable. "Mama," Lucia said again. Maria collapsed forward, pressing her face into her daughter's blanket as sobs finally broke free from her chest. She gathered Lucia into her arms, holding her with a trembling force born of years of silence shattered in an instant. Behind her, the door creaked softly. Two friars stood frozen in the doorway, drawn by the sound they could scarcely comprehend. One of them clutched the edge of the doorframe as though steadying himself. The other made the sign of the cross, his lips moving soundlessly. No one spoke. The word had said enough. Lucia rested calmly against her mother's shoulder, her expression serene, almost puzzled by the sudden emotion she had caused. She did not cry. She did not repeat the word again. It had served its purpose. The silence that followed was not heavy, not charged with fear or resistance. It was reverent, fragile, as though any sound might fracture something holy and new. Maria lifted her head slowly, her face streaked with tears. She looked at the friars, her eyes wide, her mouth open in disbelief. One of them nodded once, his expression solemn, overcome. No explanation was offered. None was needed. For the first time in 6 years, Lucia had spoken. Not to the world, not to the darkness that had once held her attention, but to the one voice she had always known, even in silence. Her mother's. In the days that followed, Lucia was no longer the child the monastery had first received. The change was not sudden or dramatic. There was no moment one could point to and declare transformation complete. Instead, it unfolded quietly, gently, like light returning to a room that had been shuttered for too long. Her eyes were the first to change. They no longer carried that distant, strained attentiveness that had once unsettled those who met her gaze. Now they moved freely, resting on faces, following gestures, lingering with curiosity rather than vigilance. When Maria spoke, Lucia looked directly at her, not as though decoding vibrations, but as though truly listening, absorbing tone, expression, meaning. Her drawings changed as well. The charcoal figures disappeared. In their place came simple shapes at first, circles, lines, uneven houses with open doors, then flowers, trees, a sun drawn too large for the page, its rays stretching outward without restraint. Maria wept the first time Lucia handed her such a drawing, unaware of why her mother's hands trembled as she accepted it. Lucia's sleep, once fractured and restless, became deep and unbroken. She no longer woke at the hour Maria had come to dread. No silent tears marked her cheeks in the morning. No whispers followed her into the dark. When she slept fully, her breathing slow and peaceful, her body at ease. When asked, gently, carefully, about the nights before, Lucia showed no sign of recognition. She did not remember fear. She did not remember voices. She did not remember listening to anything unseen. It was as though that chapter of her life had been sealed away, not erased, but rendered inaccessible, mercifully distant. The friars did not press her. They asked no probing questions, offered no interpretations. Some knowledge, they believed, was meant to be carried only by those strong enough to bear it. Lucia was a child again. That was enough. One afternoon, as Maria sat with Lucia in the monastery garden, the child paused in her play and looked up suddenly, her expression thoughtful. "Mama," she said, the words still new but no longer fragile. "Yes, my love?" Lucia hesitated, searching for something just beyond reach. "I don't remember being afraid," she said slowly, "but I remember a man." Maria's heart tightened, though she kept her voice calm. "What man?" She lifted her hands and pressed them together, palm to palm, as if holding something invisible between them. "His hands were hurt," she said simply. "He wore brown." Maria did not speak. "He told me not to be afraid," Lucia continued, her voice steady, untroubled. "He said I could rest now." She returned to her drawing as though nothing remarkable had been said. Maria sat very still, the sounds of the garden fading around her. She did not ask for more. She did not need to. The words had not been spoken for explanation, but for release. That evening, as Lucia slept peacefully beneath the monastery roof, Maria knelt in gratitude, not for understanding, but for mercy. Her daughter had returned to her, and whatever had once held Lucia in darkness no longer had a voice. The days that followed did not belong to wonder, but to responsibility. Once Lucia's condition stabilized and her newfound speech continued without regression, the monastery turned quietly to its duty. No announcements were made. No pilgrims were summoned. The friars understood that what had occurred, however extraordinary, required discernment rather than celebration. A small room in the archive wing was prepared. Its table was cleared, its chairs arranged with deliberate order. There the testimony was gathered, not in haste, not in excitement, but with the measured gravity the Church reserved for matters that brushed too closely against the unseen. Maria was the first to speak. Her account was taken slowly, recorded by hand as she described Lucia's silence, the signs of disturbance, the journey to the monastery, and the events that had unfolded within its walls. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. When she reached the moments she could not explain, her voice faltered, and the friar recording her words noted the pauses without filling them. Two friars added their own testimony. They spoke of observations rather than conclusions, the child's reactions to prayer, the night of resistance, the collapse before the relic, the profound stillness that followed. They avoided language of accusation or certainty. Precision mattered more than interpretation. A physician from the nearby town was summoned. He examined Lucia thoroughly, her hearing, her vocal capacity, her reflexes. His notes were clinical, restrained, and increasingly cautious. He acknowledged the absence of trauma, infection, or developmental explanations sufficient to account for the changes observed. "I cannot explain this," he wrote. "I can only confirm what I have witnessed." Each testimony was reviewed, each page was signed. When the final document was complete, it was placed within a thick folder marked clearly in ink, Archivio Riservato, Caso Infantile, file number XX/P-19XX. The abbot himself oversaw the sealing. Wax was pressed carefully, The folder was bound and labeled, then returned to the deepest shelf of the archive, where only a few were permitted to enter. No declaration followed. The Church did not proclaim a miracle. No investigation was opened for canonization or public devotion. Silence was chosen, not as denial, but as protection. Protection of the child, protection of the faithful, protection of a mystery not meant for display. Some truths, the friars believed, carried greater weight when borne quietly. Maria was informed only that the case had been recorded. She asked no questions about titles or judgments. Her concern was simpler. She wished to return home with her daughter. When she left the monastery, Lucia walking confidently at her side, no one stopped them. No one offered blessings for the road. Their departure was as quiet as their arrival. Behind the stone walls, the file remained, not forgotten, not dismissed, preserved in silence, waiting, not to be proven, but to be remembered by those entrusted to guard it. Silence within the Church has never meant absence. It has meant restraint. Those who expected declarations or proclamations misunderstood the nature of what had occurred within the monastery walls. The Church did not rush to affirm the event, nor did it seek to discredit it. Instead, it chose a third path, one older, quieter, and far more demanding: discernment. Miracles, the friars understood, are not measured by astonishment, but by their fruits. Curiosity can be stirred by spectacle, faith cannot. To speak too quickly of what had happened would have been to risk turning a child's suffering into an object of fascination and prayer into performance. The Church had learned this lesson before. Throughout history, countless extraordinary events had demanded careful silence, not because they were false, but because truth, when exposed without wisdom, can be distorted by fear, pride, or desire. The task of the Church was not to multiply wonders, but to guard souls. And so, the case was neither affirmed nor denied. No language of possession was used. No claim of supernatural intervention was proclaimed. The testimonies were preserved, the facts recorded, and the mystery left intact. What could be stated with certainty was stated. What could not was left untouched. This restraint was not doubt, it was humility. To declare a miracle is to accept a burden as great as the miracle itself. It demands responsibility, not only for belief, but for the consequences that belief may bring: pilgrimages, expectations, misunderstandings. In this case, the Church judged that the greater good lay in allowing the event to remain what it had always been: an act of mercy directed toward one child, not a sign intended for public consumption. The friars spoke of it rarely, and only among themselves. When they did not speak of darkness or triumph, but of obedience. Obedience to prayer, to patience, to the quiet authority that refuses to command what can be entrusted to God. Faith, they believed, grows best in shadow. Those who knew the child before and after needed no proclamation. They saw the change in her eyes, heard it in her voice, recognized it in the peace that replaced fear. That was enough. The miracle, if one dared to use the word, had accomplished its purpose. It had not drawn crowds, it had not provoked debate, it had not demanded belief. It had restored a soul. And so the Church remained silent, not out of uncertainty, but out of reverence. Some truths are not meant to be spoken aloud, not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to stand without being named. In the end, silence was not the absence of faith, it was its safeguard. The old friar closed the folder gently, as though afraid a careless motion might disturb what lingered within its pages. The dust stirred briefly, then settled again, obedient to time. Around him, the archive remained unchanged, rows of shelves, the faint scent of parchment, the quiet weight of memory. He rested his hand on the cover once more. Archivio riservato. Caso infantile. File nomer XXP 18XX. So many years had passed since the child and her mother had walked out through the monastery gates, unnoticed and unremarkable to the world beyond. No reports had followed, no inquiries had been made. The file had slept, undisturbed, while life continued as it always did. That, he thought, was perhaps the truest sign of mercy. The friar slid the folder back into its place, behind heavier volumes that spoke of councils, decrees, and decisions rendered in ink in authority. This story belonged elsewhere, not among proclamations, but among prayers. As he turned to leave, his lips moved in a whisper meant for no one in particular. "Not every miracle is meant to be known," he said softly. "Some are meant to be lived." The lamp flickered as he extinguished it, and the archive returned to shadow. Outside, evening bells rang, steady and familiar, calling the faithful to prayer once more. Within the stone walls, silence resumed its watch, patient, attentive, complete. The file remained where it had always been, not hidden, not revealed, simply kept, waiting, not for recognition, but for remembrance in the hearts of those who understood that faith does not always announce itself. Sometimes it walks away quietly, hand in hand with a child who has learned, at last, how to speak. This is a fictional story inspired by spiritual traditions surrounding Padre Pio, created for educational and humanistic reflection. It does not claim historical documentation or ecclesiastical judgment, but invites contemplation on faith, humility, in the quiet ways grace may enter human lives.